This is the third Sabbath of Advent. It is the Sabbath of Joy. We heard about that in Sabbath school this morning. The lesson being Mary going to see Elizabeth and the joy that was there. Advent is a time to prepare for the coming of Christ. And during this time of the year, we are called to keep alive the vision which provides us with hope and to seek the peace of God. When the angels appeared in the sky announcing the Lord's birth, I bring you tidings of great joy. For in the city of David was born this night the Christ, the Lord. Boy, I'll tell you, it's hard to keep that into perspective with all of the trappings and the trimmings of Christmas that we see around us. But joy is something that I want to talk about this morning. Joy is not something that we seek. Joy is really that emotion which overtakes us while we're working to keep the vision alive and walking on the path that Jesus has set before us. Again, I'm taken back to the Sabbath school lesson this morning, where Mary goes to visit Elizabeth. Mary has been told that she will be overshadowed by the Holy Spirit, that she will conceive, that she will bear a son. But then the angel says that Elizabeth has also conceived. And so Mary goes to see her. And there is great joy. I have been in hospitals when children have been born. And the great joy that comes. You know, it's like dads. You know, I've stood at the windows watching the babies. Okay? And the dads will do this. It's mine. That's mine. It's not something that you can plan for. It's something that overtakes us. I was struck by that. That joy is something that overtakes us. Have you ever been overtaken with joy by the Lord? Are there those moments in time when maybe the circumstance that you find yourself in has not been the greatest? Maybe you have failed an exam. Maybe there's been the loss of a loved one. Maybe there's been the breaking of a relationship. And yet, in the midst of that, have you ever encountered God to the extent that joy just kind of overwhelms you? It's difficult. It's not something you seek after. It's something that overtakes us. As we walk along this path that we call life, we gain glimpses of what it is that God is about. We encounter situations where we see God's promises coming true. And we have suddenly great joy in our hearts. Imagine, if you will, for a moment, John the Baptist in prison. Herod is about to kill him. Open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 11. Matthew chapter 11, starting at verse 2. and going through verse 11. Now when John, while in prison, heard of the works of Christ, he sent word by his disciples, and he said to them, "Are you the expected one, or shall we look for someone else?" Jesus answered and said to them, "Go and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. Blessed is he who does not take offense at me." As these men were going away, Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. "What did you go into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? But what did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing? Those who wear soft clothing are in king's palaces. But what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you. And one who is more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, 'Behold, I send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you.' Truly I say to you, among those born of women, there is not one arisen, anyone greater than John the Baptist. Yet the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he." John is uncertain about his future. Well, maybe not. He knows that he's going to die, but I think the thing that concerns John is my ministry completed? He's uncertain because of that question whether Jesus is the Messiah. He's been proclaiming the coming of the Messiah, but now in his prison, waiting to die, he has questions. I don't believe that there is one of us who has not, at some point in time, had that same question. Are you really the Messiah? Are you the one that we've been looking for? Or should we seek someone else? And that generally happens, I don't know for you, but for me anyway. When either I'm sick, and I mean physically ill, or things don't go the way that I want them to go, or plan for them to go, or thought that they would go. Or the way that you believed that they would go. And so I confess to you that there is those moments in time when we question, are you the Messiah? And yet, this is what happens. In the midst of that questioning, maybe even doubt, the Lord reveals himself. The Lord intervenes in our lives, and suddenly hope, joy springs up. Have you ever felt that? Just when things seem the darkest, the Lord reaches down and gives us a reason to hope, a reason for joy. I think about Mary. Can you imagine a young lady, maybe 15, 16 years of age, and an angel comes and says, you're going to give birth to a baby. You won't have relations with a man, but you're going to give birth to a baby, and he's going to be God's son. Can you imagine? And we talked a little bit about that, about what Mary was feeling. I don't know. I'm sure that she had all kinds of questions, and yet, if you read that account in Luke, you will find that in the end she goes, whatever. You know, whatever the Lord wants, I'm going to do that. I'm open to that. And so in the middle of a very unsettling time for this young girl, there comes this immense joy. And then that is compounded when she hears that Elizabeth is going to give birth, and she's 6 months pregnant, and so she goes off to visit with her. And the minute that she walks in the door, John leaps in Elizabeth's belly. And Elizabeth gives this great proclamation, if you will, in honor to the Lord. Now, I don't know about you, but and my mind is somewhat dulled because it has been years and years and years since Margaret was pregnant. But I know that for her, being 6 months pregnant, there was some moaning and groaning. Am I right? And yet what happens? In the midst of all of that, when Mary walks through the door, there is immense joy. Well, let's go back to John. Because John wonders. And imagine how John felt when these disciples came to John and said, this is what he said. The blind receive their sight. The lame walk. The lepers are cleansed. The deaf hear. The dead are raised. And the poor have good news brought to them. Blessed are they who take no offense in me. Now, we don't have any biblical indication, but I believe that John experienced joy. And he experienced a dissipating of any doubts that he had, and those doubts being brought on by his situation, his circumstances. How many times in our lives is joy sucked out of us because of our circumstances? And yet we serve a God who doesn't change. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. He's always going to be the giver of life. He's always going to be the one that is going to heal, touch us inwardly, revealing himself to us. Imagine how John felt when all that he yearned for, all that he believed, all that he had proclaimed was in fact happening. I imagine that it was immense joy. Turn to Isaiah chapter 35. John had just heard from the lips of the disciples the very kind of word that Isaiah spoke of. First 10 verses of Isaiah 35. The wilderness and the desert will be glad, and the Arabah will rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It will blossom profusely and rejoice with rejoicing and shout of joy. The glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They will see the glory of the Lord, the majesty of our God. Encourage the exhausted, strengthen the feeble. Say to those with anxious hearts, take courage, fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance. The recompense of God will come. But but he will save you. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped. Then the lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute will shout for joy. For waters will break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the Arabah. The scorched land will become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. In the haunt of jackals, its resting place, grass becomes reeds and rushes. A highway will be there, a roadway, and it will be called the highway of holiness. The unclean will not travel on it, but it will be for him who walks that way. And fools will not wander on it. No lion will be there, nor will any vicious beast go upon it. These will not be found there. But the redeemed of the Lord will walk there. And the ransomed of the Lord will return and come with joyful shouting to Zion. With everlasting, what? Joy upon their heads. They will find gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. Sounds familiar, does it not? Jesus saying to John, I am the fulfillment of that which is written. I am the one who has come. I am the Christ. I am the Messiah. And to John he gave the gift of joy. Even in the darkest of circumstances. When we see the works of God being done, we receive the gift of joy. And when we allow God to do his work through us, we give the gift of joy, or at the very, very least, its possibility. Joy is a wonderful thing. A thing that overtakes us, overwhelms us when we are on the path shown to us by the Christ. It's not continuous, or at least in this world, but it pops up whenever we see God at work healing the sick, curing the lame, giving sight to the blind, proclaiming good news to those who are poor. It pops up when we do the work of God and understand that God is doing his work in those circumstances that we find ourselves in. Everlasting joy comes, as Isaiah says, on the day of Christ's second coming. On that day he testifies that the wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and bloom. Like the crocus it shall blossom abundantly. On that day the ransomed of the Lord will return and come to Zion with singing, and everlasting joy will be on their heads. They shall obtain joy and gladness. Sorrow and sighing will flee away. I watch television and people, the ads are all over from a number of different venues trying to get us prepared for Christmas. Are you ready? Are you prepared for Christmas? What can you do to prepare for this joy? Be willing to receive it. Be willing to understand that in this day, in this age, when things are so convoluted and there is so much upheaval, that God is preparing himself to reveal himself to us so that we can have joy. Because isn't that what Jesus promised us? I have come that you might have joy, and that my joy in you might be full. But if we're not prepared to receive the joy that comes with Christ revealing himself, then we will miss the joy. And I think that that's what's happened in our world today. Where there is anger, where there is division, where there is hurt, it's because they've lost the joy of this one that we call the Christ. This one who God sent into this world to be our peace, to be our hope, to be our joy. The day is coming when joy will overtake the world. Every knee will bow. Every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. But what about today? What about this joy that springs up within us as we prepare to celebrate the Lord's birth? I pray that we will be prepared, that in this, that as we come to the end of 2016, that maybe in ways which we didn't even expect, that God will reveal himself. That Jesus will become more real to us. And instead of bemoaning the fact, that there are so many ads on television and so many people are into the material things, that somehow God will break into all of that and touch our hearts and our lives and give us immense joy.